Hi, thanks for stopping by Grains in Small Places, and today, are you ready? Because you are all asking and begging for this video. So I really wanted to deliver to you how to create your own sourdough starter using freshly milled flour. So I was kind of hesitant on putting out this video on any sourdough things because there's a lot of things that can go wrong, but there's also a lot of things that can go right. So I'm not an expert at sourdough, but I have been using it for many years. I do use it with my fresh milled flour, and apparently there's not a lot of information out there for sourdough with 100% fresh milled flour. So I guess I'm delivering that today. So let's get started. Okay, so the first thing we'll go over is what do you need to get started. It's pretty basic. You're going to need a clean container. Just a regular mason jar is fine. You can use the pint or the quart size. You want to make sure that whatever container you're using is clean because contamination in your water or contamination on your hands or your vessel could all cause, you know, anything to contamination to go wrong here. So what I like to do is take my little ring and lid that comes with the mason jars. I will take the lid and I will flip it upside down, and I will put that side up so that there is still breathing in here, but it's not, it's sealed and it's not allowing dirt, dust, debris, bugs, anything into that. I know there's a lot of people that like to use a piece of cloth here. Some people have great success with that. I've also seen horror stories of it causing mold spores to be able to get through there. So just think about those things when you're trying to pick your vessel, but this is just as basic as it gets, and that's what I've always used. So the second thing you're going to need is water, and you need to make sure that it is non-chlorinated. It can be filtered water. Sometimes I'll use it from my refrigerator that goes through a filter that takes out the chlorine. We're traveling around all the time, so I don't really know the chlorine content in every water system. So a lot of times, if you're unsure, just go with bottled spring water. So I have bottled spring water is always a great bet to use if you're unsure, because sometimes if you have chlorinated water, that can kill your cultures in your starter. So if you never have anything growing, it could be because your water has a higher chlorine count to it. The third thing you're going to need, obviously, is some wheat berries so that you can mill your fresh milled flour. So you can either mill your flour day by day, so each day mill as much as you need, which is the method I like to do just because it's easier. I can measure it right out, have no issues. But if you don't want to do that, your other option would be to mill a large quantity of flour, put it in some kind of a sealed freezer safe container, keep that flour in the freezer. So every time you go to feed your starter, you can get it out of your freezer, and then you could just measure it from there and then put it back in your freezer, and you'll just have a larger amount. So whichever way is more comfortable for you, either way is fine. Okay, and the fourth last thing you need to get your starter started is some kind of digital scale. I guess it doesn't have to be digital. It could be either kind of scale, but you want to make sure it's pretty accurate down to the grams because we're going to be measuring pretty much all of it in grams. So if you don't have a kitchen scale yet, grab yourself one because they're pretty inexpensive, but it's going to be a lifesaver anytime you're baking with sourdough. A lot of the recipes out there are all in grams. Now, I try to put my recipe in both ways, but I think you'll find that it's more accurate when you're using the weights rather than the volumes, because whoever scoops out the flour, each one of those scoops could be a different amount of volume. So, you know, I could scoop out flour in 1 cup, and it might be, you know, 110 grams, or scoop it out and it might be 125 grams, and it looks exactly the same in the scoop. But if I'm measuring 120 grams and my scale, I always am going to be getting 120 grams of flour. So I hope that makes sense, not trying to be confusing. But now that we've gone over the things that we're going to need to get started, let me go over some other things with you. So today I'm going to be using hard white wheat. You can use hard red wheat. You can honestly use any flour or any leftover flour, mixes of flours, whatever fresh milled flour you want to use. I'm just going to start with hard white wheat because it seems to be the most common that we're going to be using for our breads. So I like to, the night before, when I give my sourdough starter a feeding, I like it to be at least partial flour of whatever recipe I'm going to be doing the next day. So if I'm going to be making bread with mostly hard white wheat, I'm going to feed the night before with hard white wheat, or at least mostly hard white wheat. If I'm going to be making like sourdough, my chocolate chip sourdough cookies, which are delicious by the way, like the best cookies ever. Anyway, those are soft white wheat, so I'm going to feed with soft white wheat. If you're making a mixture of a bunch of things the next day and you need to make a large quantity of sourdough starter, you can mix and match with the grains. You'll find out as you get started which ones your starter likes better and which ones your starter, has preferences and not. Now, I will tell you this. If you're having a little bit of problem with getting your sourdough starter active, now, this isn't something you necessarily do in the first 1 or 2 days because we're trying to get basically cultures from the air to come in and start growing, and then you want the good bacteria and yeast to take over the bad bacteria and yeast, and that's why in the beginning you have that little struggle going on, and sometimes you'll get like a false rise, and then the next day it won't do a whole lot. That's normal. And that's just the good and bad trying to balance out. So that's why in the beginning, I recommend not to use your discard that you're going to be throwing away, at least for the first 7 days. But really, you don't want to be using the discard until it's consistently doubling every day. Then you know that the good cultures have taken over and the bad cultures are gone, and you don't have to worry about feeding your family or yourself any bad little whatever could be there. So just in the beginning, no, at least the first 7 days, maybe longer, you won't be using your discard in recipes yet. So try to be patient. This is something that takes a little bit of time, and sourdough is something that doesn't play by its rules. So it does kind of what it wants to do, but just have patience and try to enjoy the ride and try to not make it too difficult. It's actually fairly simple once you understand it's a living thing, so it needs to breathe, it needs to eat, and it needs to drink. And we need to make sure that we're giving the correct amounts of those things. I went way off track. So what I was saying prior, sourdough starter really likes rye. So if you have rye and let's say you need a lot of activity from your starter, you want your starter is nice and matured. It's, at least 14 days old. It's doubling every day. You're doing all this thing, but you want it to have a super big boost for a bread you're going to be making. Then you can always feed it a little bit of rye. It loves rye. I have not found a sourdough starter yet from any reports that doesn't like rye. I think it just has a higher yeast count to it, so it just really helps kind of blossom that. So that's just a little trick tip for you. So when you're working with fresh milled flour and sourdough, if you're an experienced sourdough baker, you may have to forget kind of all of those things that you have learned, because fresh milled flour is very different with sourdough than white flour. So first biggest difference is it ferments much quicker. So this usually means we can't do an overnight ferment, or if we want to do an overnight ferment, we have to use a very small portion of our starter, and it has to be a short overnight ferment. Otherwise it becomes just way too sour, almost inedible. So even the people that like the sour sourdough, it's not desirable. I have let it do the many trial and error, and I have learned it's just not tasty. So when we're looking at sourdough starter with fresh milled flour, I have noticed that sometimes it will double in my jar in a couple hours, and I may have to feed it 2 to 3 times a day when it's super active, which in turn then sometimes I will put him in the fridge. If I put it in the fridge, that does give a little bit more of a sour flavor, especially if we go long times without feeding. So never go more than a week without feeding, but honestly I would say never go more than a couple days without feeding in the fridge. On the counter, you need to at least be feeding once a day, if not twice a day, once it's matured and going strong. So if you've made sourdough with white flour, you will notice that sometimes it will take 4, 6, 8 hours for it to double. So if you think about that in the perspective of our digestion in our bodies, how much longer it takes to digest that white processed flour, and you think about it in our guts, how much longer it takes our bodies to digest that white processed flour, that's one of the main reasons switching over to fresh milled flour can kind of help a lot of health benefits. People that, you know, you eat the white flour food, even with sourdough, and you kind of feel blah afterwards. That just doesn't seem to happen once you start using fresh milled flour. So that's kind of a huge difference, but you can see it happen in the jar. You know what's happening inside. Okay, so let's get started on making our very first, this is day 1. So our very first day of fresh milled flour, we're going to start out, you can start out, there's tons of recipes on the internet, and there's tons of tips on the internet for sourdough starters, which is one reason I was kind of thinking this video was not necessary, but I do realize that most of those starters are for white flour, so a lot of the tips are for white flour. So we're going to start out again with, like I was saying, the hard white wheat. I'm going to start with 50 grams of hard white wheat. I'm going to measure that out in my bowl, and I'm going to get 50 grams of I'm going to use this bottled spring water, and the same amount. So if you want to use a larger amount, 100 grams and 100 grams, 75 grams, 75 grams, whatever, it doesn't matter. They just need to be the same weight, not the same volume. So not a cup and a cup. We need to do 50 grams, 50 grams. And we're going to stir that fresh milled flour together with the water, and then we're going to put that in our jar, and we're going to let that jar sit for 24 hours. So we'll come back tomorrow and we will take a look at mine together, because I'm going to make one with you. We're going to take a look at mine tomorrow, and probably not a lot is going to happen yet because it's just now a baby. So we're going to mix them. We're going to look at it after the first day. The second day probably we'll just be looking at it, and then the third day we'll have to discard and start feeding again. So when we get to day 2 and 3, I will update you on what that looks like. So right now I'm going to go ahead and we're going to feed 50 grams of hard white wheat and 50 grams of filtered water. Okay, day 1. All right, we're going to go with 50 grams hard white wheat. Now if I'm weighing out 50 grams of hard white wheat, that should give me 50 grams of hard white wheat flour. That's not the same as if I'm using a cup of wheat berries will not give me a cup of flour, but 50 grams of wheat berries should give me 50 grams of flour. Okay. You want to make sure you have clean hands before you do this. You don't want to, you know, right off the bat contaminate your new starter. So I'm going to take this over to the mill, and I'm going to go ahead and mill this into the flour. I'm using my Nutrimill Harvest Grain Mill, and I have a coupon code GRAINY, and you can use that coupon code to get $20 off any Nutrimill or Bosch mixer or any of the Nutrimill grain mills on their website. So I'll put a link down in the description box below, and you can use that coupon code to save 20 bucks. I'm going to turn this on, and then I will tighten this until I just hear the stones touching. Then I'll pour the wheat berries in and tighten it just a hair more, not too much. And then that will give me my nice fine flour. So here we go. You can hear the stones touching a little bit. Then we want to loosen this up. A little bit still coming out there. And turn it off. It's as simple as that. Okay, so now we have our freshly milled flour. I'm going to zero this out, and I need 50 grams of water. So rather than pouring this straight into here, which Sometimes I do without thinking about it. I'm just going to go ahead and just continue to do this. Pour it in here and transpose it, I guess, over here because sometimes it sprays everywhere. Okay, this is going to sit on my counter right next to it so that I can use this tomorrow or the third day, whatever day we end up feeding him again. I'm going to go ahead and just grab a spoon and stir this together. So there's just these two ingredients is all it is. You want to make sure that you stir it so that all the dry flour gets moistened. You don't want any dry flour left. So make sure there's no pockets in there because then it won't ferment properly. And you'll end up with a weird dry clump in the middle of your starter. Okay, so that's all it is. It's just 50 grams of each. You don't want to start out with something too big because you're going to be throwing a lot of this away. So it might feel like a lot of waste, but in the beginning, that's just what we got to do. Okay. You don't have to do this part. I'm just smashing it down so that I can show you. Okay, another thing, make sure whenever you're making your sourdough starter, feeding it anything, your discard, make sure not to throw it down your sink because no matter how much water you run with it, it's going to make layers and layers of basically concrete in your plumbing. So make sure to just throw it in the trash. Any of the big portions, even this, I'll probably just scrape into the trash. But then the rest of it, I'll rinse it out just this little bit. But just make sure you're, being a good steward to your plumbing and not putting the sourdough starter down your drains. So now I'm putting, the lid I mentioned, I had the lid upside down than you would normally have it, and I just screw that on. It doesn't have to be super tight, but I don't want anything getting in there. And then I really like to use these dry erase markers. So I don't have a name yet, so comment down below if you want me to give this one a name. If you've been watching me for a while, you know that my current sourdough starter's name is Bubbles. He wants to make an appearance. He's currently living in my fridge right now, but as you can see, there he is. We just fed him because I just got done making stuff with him and put him back in the fridge. Okay, so I like to take these dry erase markers and just put a little line on my jar. If you don't have a dry erase marker, you could use a rubber band or whatever just to mark where the top of this is at. So if you can see there, that's the top. I moved it around in the jar. That's the top of my starter. Now I do not expect any kind of rise or anything like that overnight. This is just getting started. So once you start waiting to see if he's doubling or not, you're basically looking for this line, and then you're going to have your starter come up about double, and then it'll end up falling back down. A lot of people say, my starter's never doubling, my starter's never doubling, because what happens is the starter doubled overnight, and when they woke up in the morning, it was back down to this line again. So a lot of times, I'll show you if we get this to happen, but a lot of times you'll get a little bit of a residue line on your jar. So look really hard. That's why I like a clear jar. Look really hard because you can see oftentimes where it's risen up your glass all the way around and already come back down. When it comes back down, it's hungry. So it needs to be fed again. So this one's not getting fed yet. I will bring you back day 2. So right now we're at day 1. Maybe I'll go ahead and write that on here. Day, I can barely read it. 1. Can you read that? Probably not. Anyway. Okay, so day 1. I'm going to set this on my counter at room temperature, and we'll just come right back to it again tomorrow. Okay, we're at day 2, and I open it up. I give it a smell. It still smells like just flour and water. It does not have any sourdough taste or smells to it. You can see there's some liquid on the top here. So what I'm going to do for day 2 is rather than feed it or anything like that, I'm just gonna give this a stir to just move all of the organisms all around. And we will check back on it for day 3. And then I'll show you what we do on day 3. So day 2, we're just checking on it, smelling it, looking for any activity or bubbles, anything like that. And then we'll come back and we'll probably discard and feed tomorrow. Guys, look. Day 3, we've got bubbles and activity, and it's doubled. So it's the end of the day 2. We're on to day 3. It is time to do our first feeding. So let me show you how we go ahead and do that, and then I will mark my jar day 3. Okay, so we're going to take our hard white wheat, measure it out to 50 grams, and then we're going to mill this. I'll bring you right back after we mill it. Then we're going to measure out 50 grams of our spring water, filtered water, bottled water, whatever you're using. Just make sure it's not chlorinated. That's 53 grams. Normally I would go ahead and use that, but for the sake of learning, I'll try to get it right on. Okay, we'll take 51 grams. All right, then we're going to take, this is starting to smell lovely, fruity, beautiful. I had showed you all of the bubbles. So I'm going to put my water back on here. Now we're at 49. Zero that out. And then I'm going to add 50 grams of this starter right into the water. Nice gluten formation. Almost there. Okay, 52. What I'm going to do is just mix this in the water. And what's left in here is normally your discard. And once you have an established starter, you can start using that discard in recipes. But right now, because we're having the good and bad bacteria trying to balance itself out, this is not recommended to eat or anything yet. So this is going to have to be discarded. And remember, I said don't put it down your sink, put it in the trash can. And then clean the jar so you can use it tomorrow for your feeding. Okay, so I'm going to take this and add it right into the 50 grams of flour. So we have an equal amount of starter, water, and freshly milled hard white wheat. Make sure that you mix this all together so that there's no dry flour showing. All right, and then we're going to put this into our clean jar with the lid upside down so that it can breathe. And then let me get my marker for marking. And I'm just going to put day 3 and then a little line right here. I know it might be hard to see in the video, but I can read it in person. So tomorrow we're going to go ahead and check on this for day 4, and I'll let you see what it looks like. Okay, so it's only been about 4 hours since we fed this, and it's already past double. Sometimes we can get this false growth, and then we think, oh yay, it's good to go. But then maybe the next day or two may be a little bit more sluggish. So we will see tomorrow on day 4 what it does. Okay, so this is day 3 is over. We're on day 4. It has now been a little more than 24 hours actually from when I fed it, but you can see this came all the way up to this line. You can see the residue all the way around the jar, and it fell back down. So this is our original line. It never even came all the way back down to there yet. But basically, when your starter feeds all the way up, right before it peaks back down, that's basically it's the most active. And then as it falls back down, and it gets back to your original line, that is when your starter is hungry. So right now, it's hungry, it's ready to be fed. So day 4, 5, 6, and maybe 7 will all be the same. We will just be discarding and feeding. So we're looking to do the same exact thing we did on day 3. 50 grams of starter, 50 grams of flour, and 50 grams of our water. So we're going to mix that around, put it in a clean jar, and then we'll check back. Okay, so now we're at the end of day 4, and you can see it's not as active as it was yesterday. So this is what I was talking about, is sometimes around that 3rd day you get that false rise. And when you smell it, it may not be as nice and pleasant, as sweet smelling as it was earlier. So we're still going to continue on and do the same thing. We're going to go ahead and feed. Right now, the good and bad organisms are kind of having their little fight with each other to decide who's going to win. So if at any point you see mold growing, then that would be when your starter is no good. Something happened, something was contaminated. So you want to make sure you're always checking for any hairy or furry looking growths. Other than that, you should be good to go. So we're going to go ahead. I've already weighed out and milled my 50 grams of flour. And the rest of this, we still have to throw away. This is not discard that we can use yet because the good bacteria has not completely taken over. So there's still some bad guys in there. So we don't want to use that just yet, but hopefully soon. And everyone's starter will be a little bit different. Some starters will be ready in 7 days. Some starters will take 2 weeks. So it really just depends on your individual starter. I'm going to go ahead and put this in our clean jar. I got it all over the side. Okay, and then in the future, if you ever want to make larger amounts, you can of course get a bigger jar, but when we're just starting out, just having the small jar with the small amount, that way we're not wasting so much flour and stuff at the beginning, because I know it hurts to kind of throw this stuff away, but it's just what we have to do to get it started. And once it's ready to go, then we will pretty much never have to throw any of it away again. Day 5. All right, we'll be back tomorrow. If at any point you get to where you see this black liquid on the top of your starter, that's called hooch. So I will let you see, I let mine sit for a long time so that I could get some of that on the top to show you what it looks like. Oftentimes if you forget it for a while, it will have some of that hooch on the top. This is not bad. This doesn't mean that your sourdough starter is dead. As long as you're not seeing any fuzzy stuff or pink or yellow things, this black liquid on the top is normal, but it does mean that your sourdough starter wants to be fed. So it's showing you that it's extra hungry. This is extra sour. You can either scrape this off the top and throw it away, or pour off the top and throw it away, or you can just stir it in. But because fresh milk flour is so much more sour than regular flour sourdough, I like to just scrape mine off and pour it off, and then just use, you can see underneath here, it's not like that anymore, but the sourness still will be throughout. But I just wanted to show you that's something that oftentimes people think they killed their starter and they have to throw it away because of this black liquid that's on top. Sometimes it'll be even thicker than that if it's been a while since you fed yours. So just showing you that that is normal and it does not hurt your starter. It just means he's hungry and ready to be fed. Okay, day 5. Now you can see it really didn't rise much. This is the day everyone says, oh no, I killed my sourdough starter and it's not working. But it's just working things out on its own. So still, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to do the 50 grams. has a little interesting of a flavor. It's not quite sweet like we want it, but it's a little bit better than it was yesterday. You can see how it's kind of like sticky and almost gross looking. So we're gonna go ahead and do the same thing. 50 grams of each, and throw away the starter, or throw away the leftover discard. That's the side. So we'll see what we get tomorrow, and I'm going to go ahead and mark this one. We'll check on it tomorrow. Okay, so we're at the end of day 6. We can see we're getting some bubblage in here, but it's not doubling yet. So for day 7, I'm going to do basically a double amount of feeding. Okay, so starting at day 7, we need to feed our sourdough starter twice a day. So as close to 12 hours apart as possible as you can without disrupting your life too much, I understand. But everyone's sourdough starter will kind of blossom at different times, but somewhere between the 7 to 10 day mark is the average time that it starts really taking off. After about the 10th day, you can start using the discard in your recipes, but it's not quite ready for bread yet or anything that you need it to like rise your dough. So you can use it in all kinds of discard recipes, but not yet your bread. You want to make sure it's nice and good and strong before you start your first loaf of bread, which generally takes about 2 weeks. So maybe our 14-day mark-ish is when you can start your first loaf of sourdough bread. So this is me basically feeding twice a day. So I'm feeding on the 7th day, AM, PM, 8th day, AM, PM, 9th day, and then I will bring you in and let you take a look here when we notice some changes. Okay, it is our PM feeding this evening, and you can see we already have some rising going on, so that is great news. Hopefully after the feeding this evening, in the morning, it'll be risen double, so we'll check it and see. Okay, so here we go again. We are feeding with 50 grams of flour, of the fresh milk flour, 50 grams of water, and 50 grams of our sourdough discard. So again, I was saying once you reach this 10-day mark, give or take, you can usually start using your sourdough discard for recipes rather than throwing them away. So here you can see me just feeding AM and then PM, so trying to do it about 12 hours apart. Say like 10 a.m., 10 p.m. or 9 a.m., 9 p.m., whatever works for your schedule the best, but try to keep it, you know, about 12 hours apart. And this is just really building and making our sourdough starter strong so that it can rise a loaf of bread, because that actually does take quite a bit of work. So we're just really making this a nice, strong sourdough starter so that it can be used for years and years and years to come. I also wanted to note something pretty important. It may apply to you, it may not apply to you, but if you have pets in your home, make sure that wherever you're feeding your sourdough starter and leaving your sourdough starter on the counter, that they can't get to it, because this can be dangerous for dogs and cats to eat, and most dogs and cats will not get into it, but I have heard horror stories of dogs eating sourdough starter, and it can actually be pretty toxic to them. So if it does happen to you, which I hope it doesn't, but if it does, contact your veterinarian right away. But just make sure that you're keeping it out of the reach of any animals in your home, just as a precaution. And then we'll just continue on. Every day that we have this on our countertop, we need to feed this. And I would say probably after the 10th day, it should be ready to start using for your discard recipes. Guys, do you see what I see? The good guys are winning. It is pretty much doubled. You can see all the activity and the bubbles in here. So this is Last night we did day 11 p.m. feeding. This is day 12 a.m. feeding. So by the time you get to your 2 weeks, so 14 days of this should be pretty consistent with its rising and falling. And once you start getting that consistent rise and then fall and rise and then fall, that's when you can start using the discard in your recipes, because now you know that the good bacteria and yeast have won. But you can see actually how this is still domed up. This is actually still rising. I'm still going to go ahead and feed it just because I want to stay on that same track as we're doing, is every 12 hours as close as we can to twice a day. So I'm going to go ahead and feed it, and then it should then be doubled by our feeding this evening as well. So I will bring you back this evening, and then I think we've got it. If yours hasn't started doubling by day 10, I would recommend using a little bit of rye flour in with your hard white wheat just to give it a little bit of a boost, but it's not required. But if you're not seeing any activity at all, this may be helpful. One of my family's absolute favorite sourdough discard recipe is the brown butter chocolate chip cookie recipe made with the sourdough discard. This recipe is amazing. It's on my blog. I can put a link in the description box below at grainsandsmallplaces.net, and I'm continuing to add more recipes as we go. Okay, so we've had some pretty consistent doublings, so that's great news. So anytime between the 7 to 14 days, if you're getting this consistent doubling that we've been getting, then you can start using this discard in recipes other than bread. It's not quite strong enough for bread until it's been consistently doubling. Generally about day 14 or so will be when you can start trying to use it for your first bread loaves. It just needs to be stronger so that it can handle rising and being the leaven, basically the sole rising agent for a bread. So once you make your first loaf or two of bread with the sourdough starter, it may not be perfect. It may not be giant or huge of a rise just because he's a new sourdough starter just starting out, but you can see all these beautiful, lovely bubbles in here. Hence, that's why my other sourdough starter's name, it got the name Bubbles. Tomorrow, I want to go ahead and use this new sourdough starter to make my brown butter chocolate chip cookie recipe, which I mentioned earlier in the video. I'm going to go ahead, I want to make sure now that we're going to start using our starter, we need to make sure that we're going to have enough to feed to continue our starter. So this gives me, I have 50 grams of starter, 50 grams of water, and 50 grams of flour in here. So that gives me 150 grams total. Well, my sourdough cookie recipe calls for 120 grams. So if I use 120 grams of my total 150 grams, then I'm only going to have 30 grams left to feed. Now, if you have a nice strong starter, that's not a big deal. I've done it many times. But in the beginning, I really recommend that you always leave yourself 50 grams of starter to feed for the next day for your next recipes. So today what I'm going to do for tomorrow, since I want to make the recipe, I'm going to feed with 60 grams of flour, 60 grams of water, and 50 grams of my starter. I could do 60 if I wanted, but I only need 170 grams total. So the 60 plus 60 plus 50 will give me that 170 grams. So I will have 120 grams to use for my delicious cookies, and I will have 50 grams to continue feeding on my starter. So the maintenance for our starter is going to be, we're going to need to feed this if we're leaving it out at room temperature, which is obviously optimal, but also not always feasible for everyone. If we're leaving it out at room temperature, then we're going to make sure that we feed this at least once a day. Honestly, if you can feed it twice a day, close to every 12 hours, that's prime. That's absolutely the best. You're going to get the best starter, the best flavor, the best rise. That is the best way to do it. I realize that that's not always doable for everybody. So if you feed it at least once a day on your counter, that will be good. Now, if you're going on vacation or you don't want to use it for a while, you can always put it in the refrigerator. But as I mentioned before, once it goes in the refrigerator, it does become slightly more acidic and slightly more sour, I guess I could say. So once it goes in that fridge, it kind of a little bit changes. Now, it's not devastational. It's not something you need to throw in the trash, anything like that. But I do keep my other sourdough starter in the fridge. This one will probably go in the fridge, and I'll just have them both as backups, and I will just decide, you know, over time, which one gives me the better rise and which one tastes better, and that will be the one that I probably keep in the long run. You can dry your starter and put it in the freezer for later, and I may make a video on that in the future. If there's interest, comment down below if you want to see a video on how to dry your starter to save it as like an emergency backup in your freezer. I do have an emergency backup of bubbles in my freezer just in case that time where you use it all or the jar breaks or someone leaves the jar in the microwave or in the oven and cooks it and it's gone. So rather than having to start all the way the whole 2 weeks from the beginning, it's kind of fast process to get it done in maybe, you know, 3 to 7 days or so with that dried starter. So again, comment down below if you're interested in that video. So let's go ahead, get to feeding this. Like I said, I'm feeding it a little bit bigger than last time. If I feed it much bigger than what it is, then I need to make sure I get a larger jar. So you always want to make sure that you have room for this expansion in here. Otherwise, it's going to come out of your jar and go all over the table and make a big, huge mess. So if you're putting this in the fridge and you do decide to do that, you need to make sure that you're feeding it at least once a week, if not multiple times a week. And anytime I get it out of the fridge and I want to use it, I need to make sure I give it at least 1 to 2 good feedings before I want to use it. Otherwise, it's sometimes too sour or it's not strong enough. Okay, it is now day 14 in the morning, or the AM feeding, and you can see this beautiful rise. We have actually more than double, but this should now be strong enough with all this activity in here to rise bread. But we're gonna go ahead and make those cookies today like I was talking about. Now this is the beauty of the sourdough starter. In the past, we've taken 50 grams out of here and fed it and thrown the rest away. But now what we're going to do is I'm going to take 120 grams from this, and it's going to go into my recipe. So this is what we call a discard recipe. So instead of throwing, look at all that beautiful activity. Instead of throwing this in the trash now, I can use this to make something. So I'm going to pull 120 grams of this to the side for that recipe. Some people will take this and they will take this discard if they don't have a recipe they want to make, and they will put this in the refrigerator. Just be careful with doing that for too long because it can tend to get a little bit on the sour side. Okay. But trying to get this one exact. Okay, so 120. This is going in our sourdough chocolate chip cookies. So in this bowl, I'm going to now take the rest of this, which is my regular feeding. Take the rest of this, which is my regular feeding, and it should be about 50 grams left, give or take. It may be slightly shy because of all the residue on the jar, but okay. All right, so now you can see we've got enough left over to feed. Jar is empty. I don't have to throw any sourdough away now. So this is basically from maintenance dose. From here on out, we're going to always save our 50 grams to feed it, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to feed it with 50, 50, 50, unless you are wanting to specifically feed for a stronger feeding. Mix this. And then I have now 50 grams. Now, if I was planning on making another recipe later today or tomorrow, then I would go ahead and make sure that I had enough for that recipe, plus 50 grams left over for feeding for the next time. So this is how basically your new maintenance for your sourdough starter. Always want to be discarding, feeding, watering, keeping it growing. That's, I think, why some people oftentimes feed their sourdough starters, because it's a living thing and they have to care for it. And sometimes when you give it a name, it kind of helps personalize it and makes it feel more like it's part of your family, like a pet. And so then sometimes it helps to remember the maintenance and maybe care about it a little more, because it actually is doing a lot of good for your body. Okay. And there are some people that will use the same jar over and over, which is fine. That may increase your possibility of contamination, but I've seen many people do it for a long period of time with no contamination issues, with no issues. I don't want to take that chance, so we're going to go ahead. Now, instead of writing day whatever, I'm just going to put a line here so I can watch, make sure we're still growing. If we ever have an issue with him not growing, we need to figure out what happened. So check out the blog post. I'll put a link in the description box below where I'm going to put, you know, troubleshooting of things that can go wrong, things to watch for, all of those things, so that if you ever have an issue, you can check it out, see if, hey, do I need to make a new one, or can this one be saved? So now you know how to make your very own sourdough starter from scratch using all fresh milled flour. Yay! So let me know in the comments below what you're planning on making first. Thanks so much for hanging out with me all week long while we made our very first fresh milled flour sourdough starter. So I hope this video was helpful to you. I hope that it encourages you to be able to get out there and just go ahead and get your starter started. And there's no better way to do it than just jump on in. So I have a link in the description box below to all the recipes. Also, there's a link to a Facebook group called Fresh Milled Flour. There, if you have any questions or problems, or you want to share pictures of your starter or your bakes, join that group, and it's a free group, and you can ask questions and all that. If I'm not able, I try to answer questions, but the group has grown so big now that I can't always get to all the questions, but there's so many other people on there that are also good at answering the questions if I can't get to it. So pop over there if you have a Facebook group, and that way you can chat with others like-minded. The whole group is based off of fresh milled flour. So don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends, especially if they're wanting to learn how to make sourdough starter from scratch at the very beginning with fresh milled flour. And thank you for stopping by Grains in Small Places. Goodbye.